Sunday dinner used to mean something. The scent of roast chicken and garlic butter used to drift through the halls like a warm memory, pulling everyone toward the table before I even had to call them. Back then, laughter was automatic, loud, clumsy, full of inside jokes and elbows bumping across linen cloth. I would hum to myself while stirring the gravy the way my mother used to, thinking I was passing something sacred down through the generations. But this time, as I eased myself slowly into the last empty chair, I noticed how the room went just a little too quiet. My daughter-in-law barely looked up from her phone. My son was slicing into his chicken with the kind of tension that made the knife seem like it was cutting more than meat. And the grandchildren, well, they looked everywhere, but at me. It was when my napkin slipped to the floor and I leaned to retrieve it, wincing a little, moving slower than I used to, that I heard the words, not shouted, not even really whispered, just tossed across the table like an afterthought. Well, she's kind of an extra mouth now, isn't she? I didn't even know which of them said it. The voice was casual. It wasn't meant to be cruel, and maybe that made it worse. Because when someone wounds you deliberately, at least they know you still matter. But this was indifference spoken with the casual shrug of someone counting coins and realizing something didn't add up. That extra mouth was me, the woman who had filled all their plates for years. I sat there, my hands trembling under the table, trying to focus on my peas, trying not to let them roll off the edge of my fork. I didn't say anything. What could I say? That I heard them. That I used to be the one who hosted every holiday, who stayed up until midnight, sewing Halloween costumes, baking birthday cakes shaped like castles, rockets, whatever they asked for. Would it have mattered? Or would that too be dismissed as part of the past, like a photo album they no longer open? The gravy was too salty that night. Or maybe it was just me tasting everything through the burn of quiet humiliation. I pushed my chair back slowly after dinner, folded my napkin, and thanked them with a voice that didn't sound like my own. It was hollow, a little too soft, as though I was trying not to disturb the peace that had already left the room. No one offered to help me stand. No one walked me to the guest bedroom, and when I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it and let the silence settle deep into my bones. That night I laid on the too firm mattress, staring up at the ceiling fan as it clicked in uneven circles, wondering when exactly I had stopped being someone important. Was it after I retired? After my husband passed? Was there a moment I could pinpoint like a single dropped stitch in a sweater that unravels everything? Or was it slower than that, like rust on a garden gate, creeping and silent, until the whole thing collapses without warning? The next morning, no one mentioned it. No one apologized or looked sheepish or even seemed to remember. They chatted about gas prices and vacation plans, while I sat with my teacup nodding, smiling when they made eye contact, which wasn't often. It was as if I had become background noise, the rustle of newspapers, the clink of cutlery, the creak of the floorboards. Familiar, but unnecessary. And yet even as I sat there shrinking into myself, a part of me stirred, a whisper in my chest, faint but insistent. I didn't know what it was yet, only that something had shifted. Something had been named, and once a thing has a name, it can't be ignored. They called me an extra mouth. That was the moment. That was the phrase. And in its sharp syllables, I felt the beginning of an ending I hadn't expected, and the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not anger, not even grief, just awakening. I remember when this table was mine. Not just physically, though. Yes, the long oak dining table still bore the polish I used to rub in, with slow circles every Saturday morning, the kind of care that leaves a sheen only time and love can create. But I mean, it belonged to me, in spirit. The laughter, the clatter, The way people leaned in when they spoke, the warm chaos of mismatched napkins and too many dishes, all of it came from me. I gave that table its life. I was the conductor of the symphony that filled it. Every holiday, every Sunday supper, I was the one who made things happen. Even when money was tight, I found a way to make the meal stretch stew with crusty bread meatloaf shaped like hearts on Valentine's Day. My husband used to shake his head and call me the magician in the kitchen, and I wore that name like a crown. Not because I needed praise, but because creating joy was how I loved. It was the language I spoke when words weren't enough. I think that's what hurt the most, realizing how quickly that language had been forgotten. After my husband passed, I tried to keep the tradition going. I still hosted. I still cooked. But something shifted like a house ever so slightly. Out of alignment you don't notice until the floorboards creak wrong or the doors don't shut like they used to. My children began taking over more often, which I appreciated at first. It felt like a passing of the torch, but gradually the tone changed. They no longer asked if I wanted help. They just took over completely. Decisions made before I could offer anything. And then came the polite suggestions. Maybe you should sit this one out, Mom. Don't worry about the cleanup. We've got it. It was meant to be kind, I think. But kindness without inclusion is just silence dressed up in good manners. And then this year, when I came to visit, I found the linens I had sewn, the ones with little stitched leaves at the corners, balled up in a plastic bag in the garage. Not thrown away, just forgotten. Like me. I held one of them to my face, remembered how I'd stitched each leaf during long nights after work, thinking of the autumn dinner I'd surprised them with. That dinner I'd even made pumpkin soup served inside hollowed-out squash. They had laughed, taken photos, said it was so extra, but they ate every bite. That mattered to me then. Now I couldn't even tell if they remembered. I move slower now. My hands trembled more. My knees ached when I stood too fast. Maybe that's all it took, a body growing older. A spine curved just a little more each year for a legacy to become an afterthought. And yet I knew things none of them had lived long enough to learn. I had survived the kind of grief that pulls you under like an ocean current and still managed to fold laundry the next morning. I knew how to stretch a single roast chicken into 3 meals. I had sat at the bedside of dying friends and not flinched when the silence got too heavy. I knew how to hold pain quietly and still serve tea without spilling a drop. But no one asks for that kind of wisdom anymore. They want apps, not advice. They want instant fixes, not slow, steady love. And when I sat at their table now, I could feel it, the shift, the strain, as if my presence threw off the balance. They used to gather around me. Now they gathered despite me. I spent that afternoon pretending to read my book resting open in my lap, while my eyes watched the light slant across the floor. The smell of reheated food drifted from the kitchen. Not bad, just hollow. It lacked that lived-in richness, that depth, that only comes when you've simmered something with care. They used pre-made everything now. Time-saving, they said. But I wondered, saving time for what? What better use was there than nourishing the people you love? Later, I wandered into the living room where the children were half watching something on their phones. I offered to show them how to crochet. One of them blinked and said, "What for?" I smiled politely and retreated. I knew better than to force anything. You can't make someone receive a gift they don't recognize as valuable. And yet inside me something stirred again. It wasn't bitterness. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want an apology. I just wanted to feel real again. Seen, needed, not for the meals I could cook or the checks I could write, but for the invisible thread I had always woven between all of them, the thread that once bound this family together, like soft yarn looping across generations. I think that's when I first thought of the nurse. Not in any concrete way, not yet. But something about her face had stayed with me from the last visit. The way she listened when I spoke, as if each word had weight and history, instead of being a long-winded inconvenience. It was a flicker then, a seed. But seeds know what they're meant to become, even when buried in silence. It wasn't a dramatic fall, just a slip. A moment of distraction while reaching for the kettle, my slipper catching on the edge of the mat like a cruel trick of gravity. I remember the silence of it, the stillness before the pain, like the world had paused to ask if I really thought I was still untouchable. Then the pain came sharp and insistent, blooming across my hip like fire under ice. I couldn't get up. I didn't cry. I just lay there alone in the kitchen staring at the cabinet door. I never did get around to repainting. That's when everything began to change. At the hospital, they kept calling me ma'am like I was already halfway into ghosthood. The doctor smiled too much, speaking to my son instead of me. She may need assisted living arrangements just until she regains mobility. I was right there, breathing lucid in pain, but present. And yet they spoke around me like I was already fading. My son nodded, glancing at me with that carefully measured concern people wear when they've already decided something, but don't want to say it out loud just yet. When I came home, well, not home, but their guest room, I heard it start. The whispering. Behind doors that didn't close fully, through walls that didn't insulate much more than heat. We'll need to look at long-term options. Maybe we can rotate weekends. She's not what she used to be. I'd lie still, eyes wide in the dark, listening to the voices of my own children treating me like a puzzle to be solved, or a problem to be boxed up neatly and put on a shelf. They didn't think I could hear them, but I did, every word. And then there were the little things. The way my daughter-in-law would move the kettle farther from the edge, not saying anything but making sure I noticed. The way they offered me the same 3 sweaters, assuming I couldn't decide for myself. They spoke slowly, too clearly, like I was a tourist in a language I'd once mastered. It stung. Not because they wanted to help, but because they'd stopped believing I could help myself. I didn't blame them, not really. Aging frightens people. They see it as a slipping away, not a deepening. They see weakness, not wisdom. They see inconvenience, not identity. But knowing that didn't make it easier. The house was different now. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The photos on the walls were all of the children. The grandkids, bright smiling, filtered. None of the old photos remained, nothing from before my husband passed. It was like the timeline had been rewritten, and I had been cropped out somewhere along the way. I tried to help in small ways, folding towels, sorting laundry, but they'd say, "Don't worry, Mom, we've got it," and take it from my hands, as if I were a guest overstaying her welcome, as if I might break something. And maybe I did break something that day in the kitchen. But it wasn't just my hip. It was my place in their world. Still, not everything was cold. When they hired the nurse, not even full-time, just a few hours a day, I expected someone distant, efficient, professional, in that quiet, antiseptic way. But she surprised me. She knelt beside my chair the first day, looked me in the eye, and said my name gently like it mattered. Not ma'am, not the patient, just me. She didn't speak to me like I was slow. She asked me things, what I liked to eat, what I used to do, what my favorite flower was. And she waited for the answers like she had nowhere else to be. I found myself telling her stories I hadn't told in years. About my wedding dress, about the time we painted the nursery green. Even though everyone said blue or pink, she laughed at my jokes. She held my hand when I winced, standing up. She braided my hair one morning and said I had the softest silver she'd ever seen. It wasn't just kindness, it was presence. And after months of being treated like a chore, like an obligation, I clung to her words like sunlight through shutters. But then I heard it. Again. A whisper. My granddaughter standing in the hall with her friend barely trying to lower her voice. Ugh, she's still here. I thought she'd be in a home by now. She doesn't even do anything. Just sits there like breathing furniture. Breathing furniture. It knocked the wind out of me. Not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it was so casual, like calling a lamp dusty or a chair squeaky, as if the woman who once carried her through storms, wiped her tears, cheered at her recitals, was now just an object, a fixture, an extra mouth. That night I didn't sleep. I stared out the window at the moonlight resting gently on the garden fence. I used to plant roses there. Now it was weeds. Weeds and something else. A feeling rising in me, not rage. No, it was deeper, slower, a kind of reckoning. Because maybe they thought I was fading. Maybe they thought I was invisible. But I was still here. And I was starting to remember who I was. They didn't even lower their voices this time. I was sitting in the next room, flipping through an old magazine I wasn't really reading, when I heard my son's voice rise just slightly above the hum of the television. We've got to be realistic. She's costing us more than we expected. I did the numbers between groceries, meds, power, and the nurse. It's starting to stretch things. There was a pause, a long one, and then my daughter-in-law chimed in. I know. I mean, we love her, of course, but this isn't sustainable. We're already saving for the twins' school, and we have the kitchen remodel. Something's got to give. Something's got to give. I sat still. So still I could hear the fridge ticking behind me, that low mechanical hum that never stops, but you only notice when the world gets too quiet. It wasn't the words that broke me, it was the tone logical, calculated, like I was a budget line to be trimmed, like they were discussing switching internet providers or canceling a gym membership, not a person, not a mother. Me. Later that night I slipped into their office while they were asleep. I'd been looking for a blanket, I told myself, something warm, but what I found was the spreadsheet, printed out and annotated with tidy lines and numbers. My name was listed under monthly costs, in the same column as the gas bill. Rent, groceries, elder care, XXX. There was a note beside it, reevaluate in 6 months. Consider alternatives. Consider alternatives. I remember staring at those words until they stopped making sense. Reevaluate. Alternatives. They sounded like they came from a boardroom, not a family, not my son, not the boy who used to run into my arms after school pressing crayon drawings into my hands like treasures. I folded the paper and put it back exactly where I found it, not because I didn't want them to know I'd seen it, but because I wanted to keep my silence. Let them believe I was still soft and forgetful. Let them think I was as unaware as they imagined. I wanted to see what would come next, what decisions they'd make behind doors they didn't think I could open. In the following days, their kindness tightened. It felt more rehearsed, more careful, like a performance for themselves. They'd ask if I was comfortable, if I needed anything, but the question always arrived late, with eyes that didn't linger. They checked the boxes of politeness without touching the spirit of it. And I began to retreat, just a little. I'd eat in the kitchen instead of the dining room. I'd take longer walks around the block when the nurse was with me. I started folding my own clothes, organizing the few drawers they'd given me in the guest room. My world grew smaller and strangely quieter, but not in a defeated way, in a focused one. Because the quieter it got around me, the louder things became inside. I started writing again, just little thoughts, in a notebook I'd tucked into my bag before the hospital almost without realizing. Thoughts about dignity, about legacy, about the cost of things and how the most expensive things in life are often the ones we never get receipts for lifetime loyalty. I wrote about meals I used to make, how I never kept count of how many mouths I fed or how much it cost. I remembered stretching rice and beans for a week without once making the children feel poor. I remembered selling my grandmother's brooch so my son could go on the 8th grade trip to Hanoi. He had no idea, still doesn't, and I would never tell him. That's not why I did it. But he knew then deep down that he was worth everything to me. And now I was being measured by my worth to him. That realization didn't destroy me. It clarified me. Because I'd spent so many years giving without a tally, and here they were tallying every day. One morning the nurse brought me toast just the way I liked it, buttered while hot, a pinch of cinnamon. She didn't have to ask. She just remembered. I looked at her hands as she placed the plate in front of me. Strong, capable hands. Not just trained present. She saw me. She didn't calculate my cost. She cared because she wanted to. We sat in the sunroom. She sipped tea. I looked at her, and something inside me ached in a new way. Not out of sadness, but out of recognition. Here was someone who still believed in care without ledger sheets, in presence without payment plans. She was not my blood, but she made me feel like I mattered, like I hadn't disappeared. That night I sat with my notebook again and wrote a single sentence. I am not an expense. I am a life. I closed the book gently and placed it back into my drawer. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew I would not go quietly into their budget. I found their group chat by accident. Not that I was snooping. I wouldn't have known how to, even if I tried. But my grandson had left his tablet on the kitchen counter screen, still lit, and when I went to set it aside, my own name caught my eye. It was right there, a bubble of text that hovered like something rotten floating in clear water. She just sits and breathes, like a plant. There were laughing emojis beneath it. A string of replies followed, one saying they should look into assisted living sooner rather than later. Another joked that I was probably immortal just to spite everyone. And then a third, my own daughter, wrote honestly, we're doing more for her than she ever did for us. I froze. The light from the screen glowed against my skin like firelight, but it didn't warm me. It scorched. I read that message over and over, as if reading it one more time would change the shape of it, the intent, but it stayed the same, cold, casual, carved in pixels. More for me than I ever did for them. I sat down in the nearest chair, the world narrowing to a pinpoint. The beat of my heart was thick in my ears. They truly didn't remember, did they? Or worse, they chose not to. It's easier, I suppose, to believe that someone owes you. That way your cruelty feels like justice, not betrayal. I remember waking up at 5 a.m. every single day to pack school lunches. Not with boring sandwiches, no, with cut fruit, shaped like stars with handwritten notes that said, "You're stronger than you think." I remember driving across town in the rain to bring forgotten science projects, staying up through fevers, sewing recital costumes from thrift store lace. I remember the smell of burnt cookies, the year I tried to make 10 dozen for their school fundraiser. I remember crying over bills in the dark so no one would see. And they think they're doing more for me. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I just sat there, quietly folding that pain like a napkin, tucking it into my lap. I put the tablet back exactly where it had been, screen down this time. It no longer glowed. Later that day, they came home with takeout, plastic bags full of cartons. They didn't ask what I wanted, didn't ask if I had already eaten. I waited for them to hand me something, a box, a plate. Instead, they said, "We didn't think you'd be hungry this late." as if hunger expired with age, as if needs become less valid the moment you become less useful. That night, in the quiet of the guest room, I lay back on the bed with my hands folded on my stomach like a woman waiting to be buried. But my eyes were wide open, and in that wide, still dark, something began to move in me. Not a plan, not yet, just a reckoning, a reclaiming. I thought of how many things I had given without keeping score, how often I had been the one to offer first forgiveness, understanding shelter, and how that softness had been mistaken for simplicity, for senility, for silence. They thought I was fading, but they hadn't noticed I'd started writing again, that I was watching, that I was listening not just to their words, but to the weight behind them. I was taking notes now, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. I had always told myself that love meant overlooking flaws, accepting less, enduring more. But endurance isn't the same thing as worth. The next morning I brewed tea just for myself and sat on the back porch feeling the warmth of the cup against my palms. The nurse joined me quietly, sensing that I didn't need words right away. After a while, she asked if I was okay. I looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, I saw not just her, but all the women I had known in my life who had served, folded, yielded. Women who had been reduced to extras in their own stories. "I'm starting to remember," I said. She tilted her head. "Remember what?" "My value," I said simply. "Not the kind they measure in numbers, the kind they've forgotten how to see." She didn't respond right away. She just reached over her hand warm over mine and squeezed, not in pity but in recognition, in witness. And I realized then that love, true love, isn't always inherited. Sometimes it arrives unexpectedly. A hand when you're falling, a voice that calls you by your name, not your function. That evening I went back into the guest room and pulled out the bottom drawer of the nightstand. Inside was a folder. It had sat there untouched for months, a copy of my will, printed years ago back when I still believed certain people would always be kind. I opened it slowly as if peeling back a layer of skin, and then I reached for a pen, not out of revenge, but out of remembrance. There was a time when I would have given everything without thinking, and in fact I did. I remember the exact afternoon I walked into the bank and closed the little savings account I'd been keeping secret. It wasn't much, just a quiet reserve of years gone by. Birthday money. I never spent the odd bit I tucked away from knitting commissions, the pension leftovers I didn't tell anyone about, because I wanted to feel like I still had control over something. I had been saving it for a trip I knew I might never take. A little dream, nothing extravagant, just somewhere warm, where the ocean hums at your window and time moves slower. But that year, my son and his wife were struggling. The mortgage had ballooned. The twins needed new clothes. She'd lost her job and he was driving twice the distance just to keep the lights on. They came over one evening, no big request, just exhaustion in their eyes, and a story half finished before I offered. "I'll help," I said. And I did. Without them even asking directly, I cleared that account, handed them the check, and smiled. "It's just sitting there." I lied. "Better used now than someday, right?" I remember my daughter-in-law crying, hugging me too tightly. My son said he'd pay it back in a few months. I waved it off, knowing he wouldn't. Not out of spite, just. Because that's not how family works. We give, we absorb, we stretch and bend and cushion. Back then, I still believed love was a sort of currency, one you spent endlessly, and the act of giving alone proved its worth. But no one ever mentioned that money again. Not on my birthday, not when they took me in after the fall, not when I overheard them calling me expensive. It vanished not just from my account, but from their memory. And that's what stung more than anything. Not that I gave, but that they erased the giving. They forgot, or chose to. I've come to understand something cruel about forgetting. It's not always passive. Sometimes it's an act of erasure. Of survival may be easier to see someone as a burden if you delete all the ways they once carried you. Easier to balance your budget if you subtract all the debts of the heart. The day I handed over that check, I went home and sat in my little apartment back when I still had one and made myself a cup of tea. I watched the steam rise, tracing it with my eyes, as if it could lift me out of my loneliness. I told myself it was the right thing, that my worth wasn't measured in savings or travel or freedom. But now, with that same sun tallying my monthly costs in Excel, I wonder what would have happened if I'd said no. Would they have loved me less, respected me more? Or would they simply have seen me earlier for what they see now, a cost, a balance they're tired of carrying? It's a strange thing to realize that the people you loved most never really saw your sacrifices as choices, only as inevitabilities. They believe you gave because you had nothing better to do. They think of your generosity as background noise, like the hum of a fridge or the creak of old floors. Constant, expected, barely noticed. But I noticed, I remembered. And so I pulled out a piece of paper and made my own list, not of money, but of moments. The year I went without a coat so my daughter could have a dress for prom. The time I pawned my wedding ring after my husband's funeral to pay for summer camp. The meals skipped, the nights spent stitching curtains instead of sleeping. The way I always said yes, even when I wanted to scream no. And across from every line I wrote one word forgotten. Not to shame them, but to see clearly. To finally say aloud the thing I'd been afraid to admit, that sometimes love given freely becomes love taken for granted. It was after I finished writing that list that I looked over at the nurse who had dozed off in the corner chair. She had stayed late again, not because she was paid to, but because she'd seen how pale I looked that afternoon. She wasn't family, but she was present. She didn't tally her time. She didn't calculate affection. She simply cared. I watched her sleep for a moment, soft breathing, her hand resting on a book she never finished, and something inside me shifted. Because love should not feel like obligation. And care should never feel like charity. I stood slowly, my joints aching but obedient, and opened the nightstand drawer. Inside were two things: the new draft of my will and the list I had just written. I folded the list neatly, slid it into the envelope behind the will, not as proof, but as record, as memory. If they ever looked inside, I wanted them to see the currency I had spent on them, even when they stopped counting. And then I wrote a note on the flap. 4 simple words. She remembered. You forgot. They didn't ask me. They told me. It was after breakfast one morning, toast dry, eggs cold, when my daughter-in-law sat across from me with a look too bright to be genuine. She folded her hands like she was preparing for a business meeting, not a conversation with the woman who once bathed her newborn in the kitchen sink while she sobbed in the other room. We've been thinking, she said. Her tone had that careful lilt people use when they're about to push you off a cliff and want you to believe you're going for a swim. It might be time to explore some more structured care. I stared at the rim of my teacup. The crack on the edge had been there for weeks, but no one ever noticed, much like me. Structured, I echoed softly. You mean a home? Not like that, she rushed to say. It's just, well, we're spread thin, and the nurse is wonderful, but it's temporary, and you know how it is. The kids need space. It's hard on them, and on you. Hard on me. As if I hadn't already folded myself into corners, silenced my cough, swallowed my needs. As if I hadn't already made myself invisible to fit the shape of their lives. That night, my son brought it up again. No apologies, just more of that glossy-eyed logic, as though affection had been replaced with charts and bullet points. "It's not forever," he said, "just a place where you can get the attention you need." But I already had that. I had it in the nurse who asked about my sleep, who remembered how I liked my toast, who noticed when my hands trembled more than usual and didn't pretend not to see. The attention they spoke of was something they weren't even willing to give, not in presence, not in patience, not in love. "You mean you don't want me here?" I said, not bitter, just plain. My son looked away. There it was, the silence that says more than truth ever could. I excused myself and went outside. The evening air was cool and the trees were beginning to drop their leaves. I used to rake leaves for hours when the kids were small. We'd jump into piles and laugh like fools. It was never a chore. It was joy. But now the leaves just reminded me of the layers that fall away, one by one, until you're bare and brittle and expected to break quietly. I sat on the porch hands, tucked beneath my shawl, and watched the sky dim. That's when she came out, the nurse. She didn't speak at first, just sat beside me. And then in that gentle, steady voice of hers, she said, "You don't have to go anywhere. You don't want to." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a lifeline. I turned to her, searching her face, and I saw no fear there, no judgment, just the calm knowing of someone who had stood beside many people as they faced the truth of how they were seen and chose not to crumble. "Would you?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. "Would you stay with me if I left here?" She smiled small and real. "I already am." I didn't speak. My throat was too tight. I only nodded, slowly. Because in that moment I knew what I had to do. Not in anger. Not to hurt them. But to rescue myself. To choose someone who had already chosen me. Not out of blood or duty, but out of something purer. The next day they gave me a tour of the retirement home. Polished floors, 2 white walls, and laughter that echoed too perfectly to be real. A woman with eyes dulled by routine showed me the common room, the game nights, the TV hours. I nodded. I smiled. I asked questions. But inside I was writing something else entirely. When we returned home, I went straight to my room, pulled out the envelope from the drawer. I added a postscript to the note I had written. "I am not leaving because I am weak. I am leaving because I am finally strong." And that evening, as they sat around the table without me discussing the logistics of my slow removal, I sat beside the nurse with a quiet calm I hadn't felt in years. They had decided, but so had I. And unlike them, I didn't need a spreadsheet to know what mattered. She brushed my hair with kindness, the way only someone who understands stillness can. No rush, no pulling, just soft strokes that whispered through the strands like a lullaby for nerves I didn't even know were frayed. The brush was hers, not one from the bathroom drawer the family stocked with generic supplies. It was wooden, old, worn, smooth by years of care. She said it had belonged to her mother. "I use it for people I love," she said simply without looking up. I sat perfectly still, afraid that moving might shatter the moment. No one had brushed my hair in years. I couldn't remember the last time fingers moved gently through my scalp without urgency, without task. Not since I was a wife. Not since my children were small and used to play with my curls like vines in a fairy tale. Now they barely noticed when I got a trim. But she noticed. She saw everything. "Do you remember your wedding?" she asked, just as a breeze slipped in through the open window, lifting the lace curtain like a sigh. I blinked, startled. "Why would you ask that?" "You smiled in your sleep last night," she said. "I figured you were dreaming of something lovely." I paused, and then the memory came slowly. like honey drizzling from a long-forgotten jar. It rained, I said, softly, just as we walked out of the church, and he held his coat over my head and said, "I told the sky to cry because I couldn't." The brush stopped for a moment. She laughed a warm, breathy sound. "That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard." I smiled, eyes wet. He was like that. No one had asked me about him in years. They stopped mentioning his name after the funeral, as if his absence was a wound that must be avoided instead of carried, as if love dies neatly with a death certificate. But love doesn't vanish. It lingers in the echoes of old toasts, the feel of someone's coat still hanging in the back of a closet you don't open. She asked what color my dress was. She asked what music we danced to. She asked if we had a honeymoon where we lived, who cooked the first meal. And I told her. I told her everything. And in doing so, I remembered who I was, before my identity became a budget line, before I was someone's aging responsibility. I was once a woman whose eyes made a man nervous in the best way, a woman who danced barefoot in the kitchen, who painted her toenails red and snuck kisses under stairwells, who believed fiercely in joy. The nurse listened like my words were water and she'd been parched. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct or redirect or glance at a phone. She held space. And in that space I began to bloom again. Later, as she folded the quilt over my lap, I reached out and touched her wrist. "Why do you stay so long?" I asked, "even when your shift is over?" She looked at me and there was no pity in her gaze, just truth. "Because you make me feel like I matter." That sentence did something to me. Because she was the only person in that house who ever said such a thing. Everyone else expected me to be grateful for every crumb, every favor, every ounce of attention. But she thanked me for existing, for sharing, for letting her see me as more than someone to be cleaned and fed. I didn't say anything. I just squeezed her hand. And in that simple contact, I understood that blood isn't the only thing that binds people. Sometimes it's grace. Sometimes it's how someone holds your story when no one else remembers you had one. The next day, the family left her a note, a schedule, instructions on what to do with me during their dinner out. I watched her read it and crumple it quietly before walking into my room, the kindest rebellion I'd ever seen. "I don't need a list to know how to care for someone," she said. Neither did I. So that evening I asked her to sit beside me. I pulled out a stack of old photo albums, the ones the family didn't bother with anymore, and we turned pages slowly, laughing at hairstyles, whispering over memories. When she got up to leave, she tucked a strand of my hair behind my ear, a gesture so small, but so full of everything I'd been missing. And in that soft touch, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Chosen. Cherished. Alive. She sat with me during the rain. Not just beside me, with me. Fully. Quietly. As if she knew that words would only skim the surface of what needed to be felt. Outside, the sky sobbed in gray, and the garden turned to a watercolor of dripping leaves and soaked petals. I used to love the rain. When I was younger, I'd walk barefoot into it like a dare. As I aged, the rain became a melody, something I listened to from porches, from windows, from the quiet corners of years slipping by. That afternoon, she brought me a blanket before I even asked, sat cross-legged on the floor, her chin resting on her hand, looking at me as though I were still whole. I wanted to tell her things, not the kind of things people politely nod to, not weather or aches or "how did you sleep?" but real things, remembered things. So I began. I told her about the green velvet dress I wore the day I found out I was pregnant for the first time. I told her how I hid it from my husband for 3 days, not out of fear, but because I wanted to keep the joy to myself just a little longer, like a jewel cupped close to my chest. She laughed when I told her how we danced in the living room the day we bought our first house, a tiny thing with peeling paint and crooked floors, but it was ours. We danced on bare feet while the movers lugged in boxes, and he kept kissing me like we'd won something grander than land. "You love deeply," she said. "I still do," I replied. She nodded, didn't correct me, didn't say loved past tense. She understood something most people miss, that love the kind rooted in memory, and sacrifice doesn't die with people or with time. It settles into your bones, folds into your gestures, echoes in the things you save without knowing why. "I brought you something," she said after a pause. She opened her bag and handed me a small photo, a dog half asleep on a couch, tongue sticking out slightly. "His name's Marlowe." She smiled. "He's a little dumb, but he's mine." I laughed, a real one, not the polite breath I'd been trained to pass off as laughter for the family. "He looks like he dreams a lot." "He does," she said. "Of chasing squirrels he never catches, of food bowls always full, of someone waiting for him." I looked at the photo again and saw it, the safety, the affection, the simple joy of being seen. "Do you visit him every day?" I asked. She looked down. "He lives with my neighbor now. I work long hours. He needed more than I could give." I watched her carefully, the way her fingers twisted the edge of the blanket. "You gave him what was best, even if it wasn't you." She nodded. "It still hurts." And that's when I understood, truly understood, what kind of person she was. Because she gave without needing thanks. She sacrificed even when it cost her softness, and somehow, despite the wear, she stayed warm. In that moment, I saw the shape of something growing, a bond not made of title or obligation, something sturdier, something truer. She asked about my childhood. No one had asked me that in decades, not even my children. I told her about the house with the blue shutters, the Sunday markets, the smell of my mother's hands after washing clothes in lemon soap. I told her how I used to hide under the bed during storms, convinced the thunder was punishment for my secrets. She listened to everything. And when the thunder rolled outside, soft and distant, she didn't flinch. She just reached up and adjusted my blanket as if to say, "Whatever storm comes now, you don't have to weather it alone." Time passed gently with her. It didn't drag. It didn't vanish. It settled. And in those quiet hours, she became more than a nurse. She became someone I would have chosen even if I had never needed care. Someone I would have invited to sit at my old table, the one with the good china and the candle that burned down to the wick. Someone who would have remembered that I liked my tea with 2 sugars and my silence respected. That evening, when she got up to leave, she turned at the door and said, "Tell me more tomorrow. I want to know everything." And I believed her, because in her eyes I wasn't a patient. I wasn't an expense. I wasn't extra. I was someone with a life worth remembering. They called her Just Help. It was after dinner, a dinner I didn't eat, not because I wasn't hungry, but because no one asked if I was. They ordered food, the kind that comes in glossy plastic containers, dumped it onto paper plates, and ate standing around the kitchen island while scrolling through their phones. I sat at the far end of the table with my tea, pretending to read the same page of a magazine for the 3rd time. "She talks to her more than to us," my granddaughter muttered, not even bothering to lower her voice. "She's just the help," her mother replied, as if the word were a cloth to wipe me clean of connection. Just the help. It stung more than they realized, not because I agreed, but because of what it revealed about them. That someone who gives, listens, stays late without clocking it, could be dismissed by status, as if a title erases tenderness, as if a paycheck cancels presence. But I didn't say anything. There's a particular silence the elderly learn to master, not the silence of ignorance, but of deep calculation. We've seen what speaking too soon costs. We've watched our words bounce off people who only listen to the sound of their own voices, so I stayed quiet and listened, not to respond, but to remember. She arrived a few minutes later, not flustered or offended, but calm with that same gentle steadiness she always carried. The way she greeted me, you'd never know she had been spoken of like furniture. She knelt beside my chair, looked at my face for a long second, as if reading a page I hadn't turned, and said, "Rough night." I nodded. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. Later, when the house was dim and the hum of televisions faded behind bedroom doors, she brought me warm milk in a blue mug I hadn't seen since my husband passed. I recognized it instantly, the chip on the rim the little bird painted on the side. "Where did you find this?" I whispered. In the back of the cupboard, she smiled. Looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. Figured it still had some comfort left in it. I held the mug with both hands, felt its familiar curve. My husband used to call it my thinking cup. I'd sip from it when bills were overdue, when children were sick, when life frayed at the edges and I needed something steady to hold. They had pushed it to the back like me, and just like me, she had pulled it forward, dusted it off, and returned it to warmth. That night we sat on the couch in the quiet. No TV, no noise. Just two women, one older, one younger, bridged by the quiet miracle of being seen. "Do you have family?" I asked gently. She shrugged. "Not really. Foster homes mostly. Some good, some not." I nodded. "I'm sorry." "I'm not," she said. "It taught me how to love people when they don't know how to be loved back." I looked at her, then really looked, and saw the traces of old wounds behind her calm, the way she always carried herself, just a bit too carefully, the way she never left anything undone, the way she listened like it was her only job in the world. I reached out, brushed a crumb from her shoulder, and said, "They're wrong about you." She tilted her head. "You're not just help, you're what helps. There's a difference." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just smiled and pressed her forehead to mine for a brief, sacred second. And in that moment I realized something I hadn't dared name until then. I loved her. Not in a misplaced, delusional way, but in the way one soul recognizes another in a sea of indifference. I loved her because she made me feel like me again, not the burden, not the extra mouth, not the woman at the end of her use. She loved me too. I knew it. Not for what I gave, not for what I used to be, but for who I was in the present, even in my aging, even in my slowness. That night I pulled the envelope from the drawer once more. I didn't need to reread what I had written. I already knew the names I'd removed, the one I had added. But I did write one more sentence just beneath her name. The only one who remembered I was still alive. They said it out loud. Not whispered, not behind closed doors, not softened with nervous glances or carefully chosen words. It was the middle of a Sunday afternoon, and I was sitting right there, in my usual spot, by the window when my grandson, frustrated over something I no longer remember, "Pois, it's just another mouth to feed." He didn't look at me when he said it. That almost made it worse. My daughter-in-law let out a sigh, didn't even correct him. My son in the kitchen said nothing, just kept scrolling on his phone like the air hadn't thickened, like a lifetime of sacrifice hadn't just been reduced to a single crude metaphor, another mouth. I sat still, my cup trembling slightly on its saucer. I remember watching a bird hop across the fence in the garden, so small, so alive, so unaware of the sting inside my chest. The sun was out. The breeze was soft, and I was being erased in real time. I had carried that boy in my arms, Stayed up with him through his fevers, told him stories when nightmares made him scream, baked him cookies when he had a bad grade. And now I was just a cost, a thing to be budgeted around, an obligation that had outstayed its welcome. Not a person, not a grandmother, not a heart. I didn't say a word. If I had opened my mouth, I don't think I would have stopped. There's something about that kind of betrayal when it comes not from malice, but from numbness that guts you deeper, because you realize they haven't turned cruel. They've just stopped feeling you at all. That night, the nurse found me outside staring into the darkness, as if answers might be hidden in the folds of the night sky. She wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and said, "You're shivering." "Am I?" I whispered. "I can't tell anymore." She sat beside me. We didn't talk. We just listened to the crickets, to the wind nudging leaves across the ground. I think she knew I didn't want words. I wanted space, witness, proof that I still existed. Eventually I said it, quietly. "They think I'm just a mouth, nothing more." She didn't flinch. She didn't rush to contradict me with forced affirmations. She just took my hand and said, "Then they've forgotten who taught them how to eat." That sentence struck something inside me like the first crack of thunder before a storm. I had never thought of it that way, that before I was another mouth, I was every plate, every spoon, every hand that fed them when they were too small to hold their own. I fed them with food, yes, but also with time, with stories, with my body, my worry, my aging, aching hours spent making sure their worlds were whole. I had been their first source of comfort, their teacher, their tether. And now I was just noise in the room. I looked at the nurse then, really looked. She wasn't glowing or dramatic. She wasn't even saying anything profound. But she was there, fully there. And in her silence, I felt my presence return to me. The next morning, I didn't come down for breakfast. I waited until they were all busy, scattered in their routines, and then I slipped into the kitchen, packed a small lunch for myself, an apple, a slice of cheese, a piece of bread, and I walked to the park down the road. I sat on a bench and watched the children play, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like an extra. I felt like someone who had lived, who had loved, who had given and still had more to give, but not to those who had turned away. When I returned, no one asked where I'd been. No one had even noticed I was gone, except her. She met me at the door with a warm towel for my hands, a knowing smile on her face. "You were where you needed to be," she said. "Yes," I nodded, "and I think I'm almost ready." For what she asked. "To stop begging to be seen," I said. That evening I took the final step. I removed the last names from the will, and in their place I wrote, "To the one who never counted me as a cost." The paperwork had been sitting in my nightstand drawer for years, quietly waiting, as if it knew I would return when I was ready. I had printed it long ago, back when I still believed in planning for the future, with a sense of hope, not defense. It was a generic template, at first the kind anyone can find online. But I had added my own notes, my own flourishes, like a recipe passed down, customized over time with love. My name was written neatly at the top, but below it the beneficiaries, the signatures. They no longer fit the life I was living. Back when I first signed it, I was still hosting holidays, still being called Mom with affection, still imagining my legacy as something passed down with open arms. But time has a way of peeling back illusions like old wallpaper, revealing the cracks beneath. I unfolded the pages again that night. The nurse had gone home, but her presence still lingered in the room, in the faint scent of lavender on the pillow, in the mug she'd washed and set back on the tray, in the way the blanket was tucked just right around my feet. She never left chaos behind, only care, I smoothed the document with my palm and took the pen from the drawer. My hand shook, but I didn't pause. My fingers had sewn dresses, cooked for crowds, bandaged knees, signed checks, and waved goodbye at airport gates. They could do this too. One by one, I crossed out the names. Not with fury, but with a kind of solemn finality, like lowering a curtain, like writing the last line of a chapter you stayed too long in. These were names I had once uttered with joy, faces I had once kissed with hope. But people change, or maybe they just finally show you who they've been all along. I added one name, just one, and beside it in the margin, I wrote, "Because she saw me." Then I folded the document, slipped it into a new envelope, and sealed it with trembling resolve. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like a boundary drawn not out of anger, but out of reclamation. The next morning, I asked her to help me to the bank. She looked surprised, not by the request, but by the steadiness in my voice. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said, holding the envelope like a compass. "Just making sure things are finally in the right hands." We walked slowly, the two of us. She didn't rush me. We stopped halfway to sit on a bench and breathe. The sky was soft that day, filled with clouds that looked like quilt patches. It was the kind of morning I might have once wasted doing chores, but now every step felt deliberate. Every breath tasted like something earned. At the bank, I handed over the documents, signed the lines, watched the clerk stamp the pages and slide them into a file. The click of that metal drawer was the sound of something locking shut, not my past, but their entitlement to it. Back at the house, I tucked the receipt away, then made myself a cup of tea. No one noticed I'd been gone. No one asked where I'd been. But when the nurse returned later and saw the envelope missing, she looked at me. I nodded. "You did it," she said softly. "I did," I whispered, and it felt like breathing after holding it for too long. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. That night I slept better than I had in months, not because everything was fixed, not because the house was suddenly warm with love again, but because for once I had chosen myself. I no longer needed to be asked, needed, or included. I had acted, and I wasn't sorry. My birthday came and went like an afterthought. There was no card, no candle, no familiar morning voices wrapping around me with the warmth of remembered dates and old traditions. The house was quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind of silence that presses in from all sides, too loud in its indifference. The sort of quiet that makes you wonder if your life is still part of the family story, or just a forgotten footnote. I woke up to the sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen, but no one came to my door. No footsteps down the hall, no knock, just the distant rhythm of a family moving around me like I was a wall to walk past. Once upon a time, I used to start planning birthdays weeks in advance. I knew everyone's favorites, the cakes, the music, the little things they'd never ask for, but I noticed anyway. I wrapped every gift by hand, always with a ribbon, always with a handwritten tag. For my son's 13th, I spent an entire night cutting out cardboard stars to hang from the ceiling. For my daughter-in-law's 30th, I baked a cake shaped like a stack of books, because she once mentioned offhand how she loved reading as a girl. They laughed, called me extra, but they always came back for more. This year they didn't even remember. I sat in the garden alone that morning, watching the wind bend the tall grass like old women bowing in slow motion. The sky was blue, the kind that might have made me weep on another day for its quiet mercy. But I was too tired to cry, too hollow to grieve something that had clearly been gone for a long time. My birthday wasn't forgotten accidentally. It was neglected deliberately, left off the calendar like a deadline that didn't matter. But she remembered. The nurse came in late that morning, a shift swap holding a small paper bag and humming. Her face lit up when she saw me. "Happy birthday," she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I hope you like soup." Soup. I didn't understand at first, but then she pulled out a thermos, unscrewed the top, and the scent hit me like a childhood memory, warm, savory, familiar. "It's pho," she said, smiling. "My grandmother's recipe. She used to make it for me every year on my birthday." I blinked. "But how did you?" "You mentioned it once," she said softly. "Told me about how you and your husband used to eat it after Sunday market. I figured maybe today could feel like one of those Sundays." I stared at her for a long time, before nodding because words felt too fragile. We sat at the little table by the window, and she poured the soup into a bowl, real porcelain, not the plastic ones they gave me. She'd brought cilantro and lime wedges wrapped in foil, and the broth was still hot. The steam rose like a blessing. I took one bite, and the tears came before I could stop them. It wasn't just the taste, it was the recognition, the way she had carried a piece of me in her memory in her hands across the city, all to place it in front of me when no one else did. She sang to me as I ate, not well, off-key, and with a little too much gusto. But she sang, and I laughed. I laughed the way I hadn't in a long, long time, the kind of laugh that comes from deep in the belly, the kind that knocks loose something inside you. When the song was done, she pulled a small gift from her bag, a wooden hairpin, hand-carved, simple, elegant. "It's not much," she said, suddenly shy, "but I thought you should have something that's yours, something not passed over or second-hand." I held it in my hands for a moment, then reached up and twisted my hair, securing it with the pin. She gasped a little and clapped her hands. "You look like a queen," she whispered. And for the first time in years, I believed her. That afternoon, I didn't wait for anyone else. I wrote a final letter, not bitter, not cruel, just final. I placed it in a blank envelope and set it on the kitchen counter where they would find it eventually. In it, I wrote, "You forgot the day I came into the world. She remembered the life I lived in it. That is all." And with that, I stepped outside. The sun was warm on my shoulders. My hair was pinned high. My back felt straighter than it had in months. And though no one in that house had called me Mom that morning, I walked out with something even more precious. My dignity. And the memory of soup that tasted like love. When they found out, the house shook. It wasn't the kind of storm you hear with thunder, it was sharper. Cold, tight-voiced questions slamming drawers, the hurried click of footsteps, and the hiss of whispers behind barely shut doors. It began when the envelope disappeared from the drawer. They had opened it probably without thinking I'd notice. Probably still convinced I didn't notice anything. And then came the chaos. My son stormed into the guest room without knocking, the old draft of my will clutched in his hand like proof of betrayal. His voice was trembling not with grief, but with disbelief, as though I'd broken some unspoken agreement by thinking for myself. "What is this?" He held the papers out like they were fire. I didn't take them. I only looked at his face. I waited. I let him rage. "After everything we've done. After taking you in, feeding you, paying." I raised one hand, not in threat, not in defense, just stillness. "You stopped feeding me the moment I became inconvenient," I said, my voice quiet. "You stopped seeing me before I ever left." He froze. My daughter-in-law appeared behind him, breathless, as if summoned by drama, not concern. "You can't be serious," she said, laughing too loud. "You're giving everything to the nurse. She's just an outsider." "She's the only one who made me feel like family," I replied. The silence that followed was thick, stunned, not from guilt, but from the horror of losing control. That's what this was really. Not about love, about ownership, about what they thought they were entitled to just by proximity and blood. "But we're your children," my son finally said, like it was a password that no longer worked. "You were," I said gently, "until you stopped acting like it." They stood there, stunned. The woman who they thought had grown too quiet, too slow, too soft, had just spoken a sentence sharp enough to draw blood. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't curse. I didn't cry. I simply stood. And in doing so, I towered. They begged then, pleaded as if words could now replace the years of dismissal. They reminded me of what they'd done for me, the roof, the nurse they paid for the bed I slept in. But none of it was love. It was duty disguised as care, an obligation handled with resentment, and I'd felt every ounce of it. Then came the threats, legal action, contesting the documents, telling the rest of the family. But I was unshaken, because finally I knew silence had never protected me. It had only preserved their comfort. Now I was done preserving anything but myself. The nurse returned later, her eyes cautious. They said some things, she whispered. "I know I said. They say many things." She hesitated. "Do you want to talk about it?" I shook my head. "No, I'm done talking to people who don't listen." She nodded, but I saw it, the emotion behind her calm, the gratitude, the ache of being chosen when you've spent your life overlooked. We sat together in the garden that evening. The sun was low, slanting gold across the stone path. I wore the cardigan she gave me, the one with tiny stitched roses at the cuffs. She brewed tea, real tea, not the dusty old bags from the back of the pantry. Chamomile and honey. It tasted like stillness. "I don't want you to feel obligated," she said suddenly. "I didn't do any of this expecting anything." "I know," I said. "That's why you deserve everything." She looked away, then biting her lip, and for the first time I saw her as more than a caretaker. She was a woman who had built her heart from broken things, who knew how to hold people without needing to own them. That night I packed my small bag, a few clothes, my notebook, the photo of my wedding day, the hairpin she gave me, and the will. I looked around the room one last time, the beige walls, the dull carpet, the cold edges of a space that had never quite become home. Then I walked out. They didn't stop me. Maybe they knew they had already lost me. I didn't leave with a suitcase full of regret. I left with the only thing that mattered, a sense of myself fully intact, and someone beside me who saw the whole of me, not just the years, not just the need, but the worth. I gave the key to her quietly. It wasn't a grand gesture, no ceremony, no dramatic final speech, just the two of us standing by the garden gate as the wind curled around our ankles, the late afternoon sun turning everything the color of old postcards. I held it in my palm for a moment longer than I needed to, feeling the weight of it. Not the metal, but what it had represented for so long. Responsibility, burden, proof of place, a symbol of how long I'd held on to a home that no longer held me back. She looked at me confused at first until I pressed it into her hand. "What's this?" she asked, already suspecting the answer. "It's yours," I said. "Not the house, just the key to what's next." Her eyes went wide. She opened her mouth to protest. I saw it forming already, the humble refusal, the flustered gratitude, the instinct to say, "But I didn't earn this." But I cut her off gently. "You earned it when you called me by name, when you remembered how I take my tea, when you asked about my wedding instead of my prescriptions, when you saw me as a person, not a patient." She stared down at the key, speechless. Her hands trembled. And mine didn't. It was strange how steady I felt, how sure, I had spent so long feeling like I needed to shrink, to stay safe, to not disturb, not offend, not demand more than they were willing to give. But standing there in the garden I once watered, and they once ignored, I felt tall again, rooted. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," I smiled. "You showed me everything." That night I didn't sleep in the guest room. I slept in her apartment, on a bed she had made up with crisp, clean sheets and a lavender pouch beneath the pillow. The window cracked open just slightly, so I could hear the wind, a sound I'd always loved and almost forgotten. The next morning we made breakfast together. Real breakfast, not reheated leftovers or half-hearted toast. She cracked eggs while I stirred the pot of rice porridge. She hummed softly as we moved around each other like we had always done it. Like we were old friends finally reunited rather than two strangers brought together by circumstance and grace. Later, I sat by her bookshelf tracing the spines of books that had clearly been loved, creased, folded, scribbled in. And it struck me that this tiny home, this quiet space full of warmth, felt more like mine than that house ever did in its final years. When the mail came, she brought it to me, a letter from the lawyer confirming everything had been filed, notarized legal. No disputes so far. I exhaled. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, better than okay, because I had finally done it. I had chosen not blood, not obligation, not legacy. I had chosen love, not the loud kind, not the kind that demands parties or Facebook posts or engraved jewelry, but the kind that brews soup from memory, the kind that brushes your hair on a rainy day, the kind that shows up over and over, even when no one is watching. The family never called, not once, not even to fight. Their silence was in the end the truest thing they'd ever offered me. And I welcomed it. Because some endings don't need closure, just courage. In the weeks that followed, we fell into a rhythm, quiet mornings, shared books, walks in the park. She started calling me her auntie when we were out, a soft fiction that made strangers smile. And in that lie, I found a truth: you don't need to be born into a family to belong. You just need to be cherished. One evening, she handed me a frame. "What's this?" I asked. "I had it printed," she said. Inside was a photo I didn't even remember she'd taken me in the garden, holding the mug with the bird, a small content smile on my face. She had written beneath it in her tidy handwriting, "You were never just a mouth, you were a heart." I touched the glass and let the tears come slow and quiet, because for the first time in years, they weren't tears of hurt. They were tears of healing.